The respiratory system. Did you know that if you hold your breath for longer than 3 minutes, your autonomic nervous system will take control? How long can you hold your breath as you continue reading? How long can you do it? Chances are you are feeling uncomfortable already. A typical human cannot survive without breathing for more than 3 minutes. And even if you wanted to hold your breath longer, your autonomic nervous system would take control. Although oxygen is critical for cells, it is the accumulation of carbon dioxide that primarily drives your need to breathe. The major structures of the respiratory system function primarily to provide oxygen to body tissues for cellular respiration, remove the waste product carbon dioxide, and help to maintain acid-base balance. Portions of the respiratory system are also used for non-vital functions such as sensing odors, speech production, and for straining such as coughing. The major entrance and exit for the respiratory system is through the nose. When discussing the nose, it is helpful to divide it into two major sections: the external nose and the internal nose. The nares open into the nasal cavity, which is separated into left and right sections by the nasal septum. The nasal septum is formed anteriorly by a portion of the septal cartilage and posteriorly by the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone and the thin vomer bones. Each lateral wall of the nasal cavity has 3 bony projections. The inferior conchae are separate bones, and the superior and middle conchae are portions of the ethmoid bone. Conchae increase the surface area of the nasal cavity, disrupt the flow of air as it enters the nose, causing air to bounce along the epithelium where it is cleaned and warmed. The conchae and meatuses trap water during exhalation, preventing dehydration. The floor of the nasal cavity is composed of the hard palate and the soft palate. Air exits the nasal cavities via the internal nares and moves into the pharynx. Paranasal sinuses serve to warm and humidify incoming air and are lined with a mucosa, which produces mucus. Paranasal sinuses are named for their associated bones: the frontal sinus, maxillary sinus, sphenoidal sinus, and ethmoidal sinus. The nares and anterior portion of the nasal cavities are lined with mucous membranes containing sebaceous glands and hair follicles that serve to prevent the passage of large debris, such as dirt, through the nasal cavity. An olfactory epithelium used to detect odors is found deep in the nasal cavity. Cold air slows the movement of cilia that may result in the accumulation of mucus, leading to rhinorrhea during cold weather. The conchae, meatuses, and paranasal sinuses are lined by respiratory epithelium composed of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. The epithelium contains specialized epithelial cells that produce mucus to trap debris. The cilia of the respiratory epithelium help to remove mucus and debris with a constant beating motion, sweeping materials towards the throat to be swallowed. This moist epithelium functions to warm and humidify incoming air. Capillaries located just beneath the nasal septum warm the air by convection. Serous and mucus-producing cells also secrete defenses. Immune cells patrol the connective tissue, providing additional protection. The pharynx is divided into 3 major regions: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. At the top of the nasopharynx are the pharyngeal tonsils. The function of the pharyngeal tonsils is not well understood, but it contains a rich supply of lymphocytes and is covered with ciliated epithelium that traps and destroys invading pathogens that enter during inhalation. The pharyngeal tonsils are large in children, but tend to regress with age and may even disappear. The uvula and soft palate move like a pendulum during swallowing, swinging upward to close off the nasopharynx to prevent ingested materials from entering the nasal cavity. Auditory or eustachian tubes that connect to each middle ear cavity open into the nasopharynx. This connection is why colds often lead to ear infections. The oropharynx is bordered superiorly by the nasopharynx and anteriorly by the oral cavity. The oropharynx contains two distinct sets of tonsils. The palatine tonsil is one of a pair of structures located laterally in the oropharynx in the area of the fauces. The lingual tonsils. The lingual tonsil is located at the base of the tongue. Similar to the pharyngeal tonsil, the palatine and lingual tonsils are composed of lymphoid tissue and trap and destroy pathogens entering the body through the oral or nasal cavities. The laryngopharynx is inferior to the oropharynx and posterior to the larynx. It continues the route for ingested material and air until its inferior end, where the digestive and respiratory systems diverge. The stratified squamous epithelium of the oropharynx is continuous with the laryngopharynx. Anteriorly, the laryngopharynx opens into the larynx, whereas posteriorly it enters the esophagus. The structure of the larynx is formed by several pieces of cartilage. 3 large cartilage pieces form the major structure of the larynx. Thyroid cartilage anterior. The thyroid cartilage is the largest piece of cartilage that makes up the larynx. The thyroid cartilage consists of the laryngeal prominence or Adam's apple, which tends to be more prominent in males. The epiglottis, or superior, 3 smaller paired cartilages, the arytenoids, corniculates, and cuneiforms, attach to the epiglottis and the vocal cords and muscle that help move the vocal cords to produce speech. The cricoid cartilage, or inferior cartilage, is the thick cricoid cartilage forms a ring with a wide posterior region and a thinner anterior region. When the epiglottis is in the closed position, the unattached end of the epiglottis rests on the glottis. A vestibular fold or false vocal cord is one of a pair of folded sections of mucous membrane. A true vocal cord is one of the white membranous folds attached by muscle to the thyroid and arytenoid cartilages of the larynx on the outer edges. The inner edges of the true vocal cords are free, allowing oscillation to produce sound. The act of swallowing causes the pharynx and larynx to lift upward, allowing the pharynx to expand and the epiglottis of the larynx to swing downward, closing the opening to the trachea. These movements produce a larger area for food to pass through while preventing food and beverages from entering the trachea. Similar to the nasal cavity and nasopharynx, this specialized epithelium produces mucus to trap debris and pathogens as they enter the trachea. The cilia beat the mucus upward towards the laryngopharynx, where it can be swallowed down the esophagus. The trachea is formed by 16 to 20 stacked C-shaped pieces of hyaline cartilage that are connected by dense connective tissue. The trachealis muscle and elastic connective tissue together form the fibroelastic membrane. The fibroelastic membrane allows the trachea to stretch and expand slightly during inhalation and exhalation, whereas the rings of the cartilage provide structural support and prevent the trachea from collapsing. The trachealis muscle can be contracted to force air through the trachea during exhalation. The trachea is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which is continuous with the larynx. The esophagus borders the trachea posteriorly. Bronchial tree. The trachea branches into the right and left primary bronchi at the carina. These bronchi are also lined by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium containing mucus-producing goblet cells. The carina is a raised structure that contains specialized nervous tissue that induces violent coughing if a foreign body, such as food, is present. Rings of cartilage, similar to those of the trachea, support the structure of the bronchi and prevent their collapse. The primary bronchi enter the lungs at the hilum. The bronchi continue to branch into bronchial tree. A bronchial tree, or respiratory tree, is the collective term used for these multiple branched bronchi. The main function of the bronchi, like other conducting zone structures, is to provide a passageway for air to move into and out of each lung. The mucous membrane traps debris and pathogens. A bronchiole branches from the tertiary bronchi. Bronchioles, which are about 1 millimeter in diameter, further branch until they become the tiny terminal bronchioles, which lead to the structure of gas exchange. There are more than 1,000 terminal bronchioles in each lung. The muscular walls of the bronchioles do not contain cartilage like those of the bronchi. This muscular wall can exchange the size of the tubing to increase or decrease airflow through the tube. The respiratory zone. In contrast to the conducting zone, the respiratory zone includes structures that are directly involved in gas exchange. The respiratory zone begins where the terminal bronchioles join a respiratory bronchiole, the smallest type of bronchiole, which then leads to an alveolar duct opening into a cluster of alveoli.